you all for being here, for sticking us out into the afternoon portion of our program. It is really my great pleasure to introduce to you all today Lisa Brooks. Lisa Brooks is an Abenaki historian. She's coming to us from, as we just heard, from Amherst College. She got her MA at Boston College, and she got her PhD at Cornell University. She also taught Native American literature, culture, and history at Harvard University, and now she's the professor of English and American Studies at Amherst. Along with all the numerous articles that she's written and presentations that she's done, her books, Reasoning Together, The Native Critics Collective, which came out in 2008, was awarded the Native American and Indigenous Studies Award for Best Book of 2008. It is a collective, a co-written book by a collective of Native authors, but nevertheless signaled out as one of the 10 most influential books in the field in the last decade, in the field of Native American studies. And also her book, The Common Pot, The Recovery of Native Space in New England, which has also been just an extremely influential and a game-changing sort of book that has kind of altered the way that a lot of us who are doing this kind of work go about doing it at this point. And I don't mind saying Lisa's been influential in the work that I do at every stage of my life as a scholar. Her work asks us to reconsider the ground that we stand on, the way that we map out particular spaces, recognizing that space is contingent upon the stories that we tell of that space. And we're sitting here in Hampton on Indian Road, no less, I believe, if I saw that correctly as I was coming in. And we map out space and we lay names upon space, and this is an act of colonization. And sometimes we forget that there are other stories and other ways of understanding this space that we are on right now. And perhaps these are something that we need to lend an ear to when we think about how we're telling that history and making our own sort of cognitive maps. So I want to turn this right over to Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, for coming. Look forward to your talk.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello.
Give me just a second while I load this baby up. I want to start with a couple of thanks. One, I want to thank Drew Lopenzina and Cassandra Newby-Alexander for inviting me here, and to all the conference organizers for doing an amazing job. I also want to thank all of the speakers from this morning for really getting me going. I've just been so moved by the talks so far, and I'm really grateful to be here in this place. I also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge my knowledge of this place is limited. I know there are so many people here who know so much more than I do, but one thing that I do know is that this was originally the Hampton Institute here. And I know that there were many Native American and African American students who came through here and were being trained to be members of a working class that would continue to serve a colonial project, and instead went on to become great intellectuals, right, who really challenged us all to think differently about this place we call America. So I really want to acknowledge those students and the intellectuals that they became. And I'm so excited that there are so many of you who are students here in this audience. And I just want to send out my good wishes to all of you. So Uligan, I want to send out my good thoughts and good wishes that you too will go on to carry on this legacy and do this work. So, yeah. So this morning, we heard from Michael about how we might really want to think about what happens to our conception of American history when we center Africa. And this is something that I often ask of my students: what happens if we center Africa? Or from my own work, what happens if we center Native space, right? So there are two centers that I think we need to really pay attention to, and American history and literature is not really possible without them. And that's the networks of the Atlantic slave trade and the networks of Native space. There are many people in this audience who know a great deal more than I do about the slave trade. So what I want to do today is try to talk briefly about how those two intersect. I'm mainly going to focus on the Northeast. That's the area that I'm from and know really well. But I'll begin just with a little reference to the Southeast. Mainly what I want you to do is invite you to consider the ways in which captivity and the slave trade played an early influential role in the colonization of the Northeast, and the ways in which the early accounts of exploration and captivity can be viewed as literary text. So Ashley Barnett this morning really did a great introduction to this, the way in which even accounts by people like William Bradford should be seen as literary texts that also have an agenda. And also, Michael pointed out to us that these explorers, for me, can be like those ethnographers of Africa. And he discussed the ways in which they not only recovered but invented these conceptualizations of Africa. And likewise, the explorers did the same for our conceptualizations of Native Americans and native land itself. Okay? The way I want to do this is in 3 parts. And I want 1619 to be sort of a center, right? So the first part will bring you back to when the Europeans first enter into native space. We're going to go much, maybe more than a century back before 1619, then move to 1619, and then move to 1675 for what's kind of a watershed moment in the native Northeast, and also for the origins of American literature. So I want to begin with a map from here in the Southeast. This is a map, oops, somehow if I step forward, there's a magic going on here. Where's that Tituba woman? Somebody's casting spells. All right, you see what I mean? All right. So this is a map from the Southeast that shows Charleston here on the left. You can see the way that the Native people who are mapping this, they're showing Charleston as a contained space. They're also showing the layout of the town, the squares. At the center are these networks of native space. This is mapping relationships of trade and exchange. And you can see that on the periphery, not at the center, is Virginia. And there's a recognition here that Europeans are seeing space somewhat differently than the native people, right? And this map is what, in the Abenaki language, we call an Awikigan, which is a word that began as a word for birch bark writings, for writings on deerskin, as this one, and then was transformed into a word that also encompassed maps, books, anything that is written inscribed upon any material whatsoever. And this is a word that's still very much living today. Okay. So now I want to take us to the Northeast and begin with these explorers who came into our territory of Wabanaki. And you know, one of the first things that happened with these people is that they were welcomed. So for example, when Christopher Levitt, the English explorer, came in 1623, he reported being greeted by a woman he called the Queen of Quack, which he was mispronouncing a place called Cascawack, place of herons, not unlike the place we see out here today, a port, a meeting place. And he said, speaking of the fishermen that came with him, "The woman, or reputed queen, asked me if those men were my friends. I told her they were. Then she drank to them and told them they were welcome to her country. And so should all my friends be at any time. She drank also to her husband and bid him welcome to her country too, for you must understand that her father was a Sagamon of this place and left it to her at his death, having no more children." Right? So you can see the way that she was actually acting as a host to the people who were coming in. They were visitors, they were foreigners, they were strangers, and it was part of her job not only to welcome them, but to figure out how to incorporate them into these networks, just as she had incorporated her husband, right? And this was not uncommon to have female leaders in our region who'd play this role. But he was also talking about a place that may have been new to him, but was not new to her. This, for her and all of the Wabanaki people who lived there, was a place that was well mapped with, as you can see on this map, towns, territories, fishing places, planting places, sweetgrass gathering places, and trails that connected them all together. Okay? And this was also a land that you'll hear me talk a lot about today, Wabanaki, the land of the dawn. The people of this place, and this is part of my family too, it's not only our job to host newcomers, but we greet the sun every morning. We're responsible for greeting the sun on behalf of an entire continent. And it's said that if we stop doing that, that the whole world could be destroyed. It's a pretty important job. And this place connects to a much wider territory. Now, this is a really different map than what you normally see when we're talking about colonial America. We often see maps of English states and towns that are to come, or we see maps by explorers who had very little knowledge of the territory. But this is a map of the entire Wabanaki, of the native space of the Northeast, and this is just merely the place names that cover major territories, right? Now, this map also represents this network of relationships between places, networks of trade and exchange. These are some of the major trade routes that cross through this area. And as the historian Kenneth Morrison has said, Wabanaki people strove to draw Europeans into an economic ideology based on reciprocal exchange between allies. So one of the first things that our ancestors tried to do was draw the Europeans into this kind of reciprocal trade. This is also recorded in our oral traditions. There are many extant oral traditions that talk about trying to incorporate Europeans, that talk about the ways in which they tried to claim space, which Wabanaki people found very curious, and the ways in which Wabanaki stories have rewritten that narrative, right? So that the English king, for example, becomes kind of a buffoon, right? Like, who doesn't quite know his own way, right? But also another force that came into this territory, and another economic ideology, was a very different form of captivity than was practiced in this place traditionally. So there were many people beginning in the 1500s who were taken from Wabanaki and its adjoining territories by European explorers, some of which who were carried into the slave trade. So the European and the Atlantic slave trade enters this continent very early on, right? For example, Frobisher, this is a picture that was drawn during the time when Martin Frobisher brought back several captives from the Inuk community, including a hunter who he brought to England to display him as a, quote, token of possession, proof that the explorer had found and claimed new lands for the Queen, right? So the token of possession is really important there. Now the word Inuk simply means human being, as does Alnoba, which is our word for ourselves. We have a concept called Alnoba Wogan, which is called, it's the human nature, it's the process of being and becoming human. It's something in which we're always engaged. And some of our stories tell too about trying to bring Englishmen into this process of becoming a human being. How can we make them behave more like human beings? But at the same time, Native people were also being transformed from human beings into tokens of possession or curiosities, right? And yet, all of these Native peoples, so they're talking about the Inuk or the Wabanaki, have oral traditions that also describe this time period when these captors came in and took people away. And just to give you a few examples of these captivities, Gaspar Corte Real in 1501, in his voyage to Wabanaki, or Newfoundland as it's known today, brought back 57 Beothuk captives. And many people, when they came in, for example, Verrazano, right, in 1524, this is 24 years after Real's expedition, it experienced a sort of defensiveness or hostility from some of the Wabanaki people who encountered them. Now, Verrazano represented this as it must be part of their barbarous nature, right? The way that they laid out a rope to our ship to trade goods with us, or the way that as we tried to move inland, we were met with warriors with bows drawn. But as several historians have pointed out, this was because of the ramifications that had already come through the land. This was because they had already experienced English and French and other Italian ships coming in and taking people away, right? And so this is one of the ways in which we have to look at these narratives and think about them as representations of the stereotypes of Native people, but also we have to think about what the impacts created in those Native people, right? Another example is a famous one, Jacques Cartier, who, when he went to Stadacona, which is now Quebec City, was saved from death. He and all his shipmates were saved from death by the Iroquoian people who gave him cedar tea, prevented him from dying of scurvy. And in return, he took 2 of their sons back to France with him. And he assumed that while there, they would be so impressed with them that when they came back, they would encourage him and teach him the ways of their land. Instead, when they went home,
They did just the opposite. And he actually then captured their father, who was a very well-known leader, and took them all back to France with him. And these stories, you have to understand, spread through these trade networks. You can see these trade networks that were moving between the St. Lawrence River Valley and the coast, right? So stories of Europeans traveled very quickly too. Now, a few other examples of captivity. In 1602, Harlow captures 5 Indians from the coast, takes them to England. One man named Epinal returns in 1604 promising to guide the English, but instead he jumps ship at his homeland, the island of Nope in Martha's Vineyard, and is still a very well-storied figure and leader there today. In 1605, Weymouth kidnaps 5 Wabanaki people, makes them slaves, and then uses them to gather more information about the area in order to extract resources for the king. Thomas Hunt in 1614 captured 20 Wabanaki people from the Kennebec River and sold them into Spanish slavery. So this was regular practice during the 16th century and the 17th century, right? And became a well-known narrative in Native space. And I just wanted to give you a quick website too if you're interested in this history. There was a conference at Yale last year that I was fortunate to participate in, and some of the lectures from that conference are up on the web. So if you want to use it in your teaching, that could be a great resource. Okay. Now, it's also important to acknowledge that there were many travelers from native space who went to Europe on diplomatic expeditions, right? So some of the French merchants, for example, sought a more enduring relationship of exchange and alliance, including learning diplomatic protocols. And thus, 2 Montagnier men traveled on a diplomatic expedition with French explorer Chauvin. And as Samuel Champlain reported, they relayed when they returned the good reception the king had given them and of the good entertainment and hospitality they had received in France. There's a map from Champlain too, right? So it was a bit more extensive than the New England ones. So there were French merchants, for example, and Jesuits who understood that there were already systems of governance in place here, that there were already diplomatic protocols that they had to learn in order to participate in the trade here, right? And that also some of these people went to France as diplomats. A very particular famous one is the expedition of the 4 Indian kings to England in 1710. This is the very famous Chief Hendrick of the Mohawks. Okay. So, there were people that were going to England and France and to Europe as slaves. There were people who were going as diplomats. And as the historian Carl Thrush argues, London actually became a hub in native space during this time, okay? So you can take a look at his work, Carl Thrush's work. You can also take a look at a great book by James Weaver called The Red Atlantic, if you're interested in exploring. This is kind of a hot topic in Native studies right now. So I want to move to 1619, which it's interesting. It's been great to learn about how important that date is for this place and for this region, because it's also a really important date in the Native Northeast. And I want to ask you what connections we can make between these 2 places. Okay? So when Europeans came, they also brought other forces with them that turned out to be extremely destructive in native space and very disruptive. One was mentioned this morning, very important, the epidemics. We cannot imagine. It's impossible for us to imagine what the impacts are when 90% of your family members, your leaders, your spiritual people, your people who know foods and medicine die, right? Right around you. We cannot fathom the impacts of that. When explorers are arriving before a very critical period of epidemic, 1616 to 1619, they're describing flourishing agricultural towns, right? Like this image from Champlain's map of 1612, right? They're describing in some cases what they might even characterize as high civilizations, right, throughout the Northeast and Southeast. By May 1619, Thomas Dermer, the English explorer, reports the ancient plantations, not long since populous, are now utterly void. In other places, a remnant remains, but not free of sickness. And so this is both an actuality, a recording of the epidemics, but it's also a representation of that void land that's just waiting for settlement, right? Simultaneously, both things at once. But during this time, it's important to emphasize, this was a time of remaking also, right? As these explorers are coming, Native people are already figuring out how to remake their space in the wake of these devastating epidemics. And I want to mention one particular leader, Nanepashamat, who with his wife, who's known as the Squaw Sachum of Massachusetts, another female leader, worked to rebuild the networks of Native space by making marriage alliances between multiple different towns and villages, between multiple territories, so that there would be the leaders there to help the people begin to recover from these devastating illnesses and the changes that had taken place. And also, the other thing that came in during this time was warfare, right? So Samuel Champlain in 1609 introduces guns to native warfare, and he thinks he's doing his native allies a huge favor by shooting 2 chiefs of the Iroquois. He doesn't realize that in traditional native warfare, it's largely a lot of teasing, right? And people might die occasionally, but it actually would be really bad to take 2 leaders in one fell swoop, right? So there was a misunderstanding right away, but it introduces guns into the space of native warfare. European trade also brings with it a capitalist economy, which draws some native hunters into the beaver trade, creating new demands and tactics, as well as expansion of territory and more intensive hunting. And we have stories about this too. One of our stories is about the great beaver. It's a story that tells us about the danger of hoarding goods and the rebalancing that has to take place when things go out of balance in that way, either economically or in terms of violence, right? And this is the image of the Great Beaver, a hill not far from where I live in the Connecticut River Valley. This is a story that's very much still alive today, and told today because we are in similar times, right? When this lesson is still important. Well, during this time, during the time of the epidemics and the rebuilding, and during this time of increased warfare, some Micmac traders come down from the north, right, who have been trading with the French. And they come down and they end up in a raid killing Nanepashamat, the great leader who has been working on this rebalancing. This is in 1619, right as the epidemics have come through. This was a devastating moment for Native people. Now in New England, the date that gets celebrated is the next year, 1620, right? The arrival of the Puritans in Plymouth, right? But what doesn't get told is that those settlers, when they come to Plymouth and then to Massachusetts, they're establishing those towns in a well of deep grief. And those Native communities are in the midst of remaking as the Puritans come in and begin to make America, right? And this is a process that's still going on today. And I think we need to remember 1619 in terms of what is happening now as well, as we were reminded this morning. And I'd love to bring you to the now, but instead I'm going to bring you to 1675 really quickly, to one of the first publications by a woman in America, or in New England, The Sovereignty and Goodness of God. It's the first captivity narrative, kind of foundational for the genre. This is a major work of American literature, part of the American canon, written by a woman named Mary Rowlandson, who was the wife of an English minister. And I just want to quickly talk about her narrative because a project that I'm working on right now focuses on putting her narrative in the context of Native space, so the networks of relationships into which this captive is taken, right? And we have a couple of maps of Mary Rowlandson's removes, the way her captivity narrative is structured. She's brought through several different places. She's brought north into what she considers a wilderness, away from her home of Lancaster, Massachusetts, and then is brought back and redeemed, right? And this is a great map of this from Neil Salisbury's book, where he lays out the territories through which she moves, but you can see the blank space behind it. Side by side with the map of Native space I showed you, I also want to show you a map from the period. This is Hubbard's 1677 map of New England. This is Rowlandson's narrative is her captivity happens during King Philip's War. Hubbard is one of the main narrators of King Philip's War. This, in short, is both an attempt by the English to claim Native territories and a resistance movement that involved a coalition amongst the Native nations of New England to try to rebalance a relationship that had gotten way out of control, right? And to try to reclaim some of the native space here. And you can see the way that Hubbard's narrative squishes the unknown interior into a small claimed space. You can see how little he understood of the territory that was north of what's now Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And so this was also the kind of map that Mary Rowlandson would have had in her head, right? There was a lot that she didn't know. This is a map that I'm working on that also maps her journey. And I just want to move over here so I can show you. One of the things that's important for people to realize is that this is a typical captivity narrative in that it starts in the town of Lancaster, which appears to be a very nice English town that is suddenly besieged by savage Indians coming out of nowhere, right? As if they're a foreign force coming in to take this agricultural settlement. When in fact the leaders of this raid were from this larger territory of Nashaway, in which Lancaster was settled. And Lancaster was originally supposed to be a trading post that was supposed to encourage exchange, right? And instead Lancaster, not surprisingly, was converging upon Nashaway. So when the leaders from Nashaway come in to raid Lancaster, they're reclaiming their own space. And they're also claiming jurisdiction over the inhabitants there, right? So when they take Mary Rowlandson, it's not random, right? And where they take her through their towns at Menominee. She's shocked. She thinks she's going into the wilderness. Instead, she goes to a place where there are 3 towns full of people, right? And then they move her through this place, which she describes as like a deep, dark swamp, but was actually a native crossroads, an old town that had been abandoned during the war by native people for safer places. And then she moves into the agricultural area up here of the Sokoke country, which is some of the most fertile area in New England. Again, deep agricultural towns. And Mary Rowlandson in her narrative is very careful to represent this as wilderness. And I can say more on that later, because that, it turns out, the more I read it, this was a very strategic move, not only on her part, but on the part of the Puritan minister who was heavily editing her text. So this is another map that shows you, this is the territory through which Mary Rowlandson traveled, the undeveloped wilderness, right? Does it look undeveloped to you? So these are the native trails through which she traveled. Here's Nashaway, where she began, right? And then she moves through this area. Do you see how well mapped this Connecticut River Valley is, right? Ashley, you'll appreciate this, because this was the country of corn, right? Deeply populated, deeply storied. This is also the location of the Great Beaver and that story that I shared with you earlier. So many people, when we're reading Mary Rowlandson's narrative, we kind of accept her what we think is her perception of wilderness. But in many ways is also a representation of wilderness that covers up this much deeper history of settlement, right? So when the Puritan narratives are written, one of the things they have to argue is that the people whom they were fighting against were not a settled people, right? And were not a people who could in any way be seen as civilized, right? Now, at the very end of this war, the last thing that I want to touch on, this war began in New England a large-scale effort to dispossess Native people through the slave trade. During the war, countless people, including many mothers and their children, were taken as prisoners and sold as slaves, transformed into commodities and displaced, often permanently from their indigenous homelands. They were transformed into property. This became a significant form of redemption for the colonial economy and cleared colonial titles to native territories, even as it also formed a significant foundation for the slave trade in New England. So we can see how the history moved from native men, women, and children being sent to England as evidence of discovery to full-scale commodification and proof of clear title to native land. So in that sense, simultaneously, native bodies become property, and also native land becomes property, which can be bought and sold and traded. And the removal of native people from the space of the Northeast is really critical to this, because of course then they're sent into the slave trade in the West Indies and Barbados. And indeed, this even may connect to Tituba, right? It's even possible that Tituba could have been a descendant from these people, right? Yeah. Not to say she is, I don't want to create another myth, but, right? But for me, as important as this part of the story is, and there are many people who are working on reconstructing it, we have descendants today who have oral tradition in their family about the people who were sent into slavery and then the people who survived. And some of those people who survived because of this network of relationships. Many of the people who survived went north through these trails into the territories of their relatives that the English could not access, right? And this is a story of survival that is very rarely told. But that's got to be a story for another day. I know I've taken up enough of your time. I want to thank you very much for listening today, and I want to invite you to continue to explore with me this notion of native space. Thank you.
I think we do have some time for questions. If anybody has them, we have a microphone over here if you want to come up and ask. We have a few minutes.
So it seems like it's a common narrative of coming in, replacing a culture, a way of being, and so forth. I know that we're talking a lot about what happened with Native Americans in this session and the one before, but it seems to be exactly the same narrative with Africans who were brought here. We were stripped of our language, we were stripped of our cultures, and so forth. And to make another correlation, it seems to be commerce is what has driven everything that is about America from the very beginning to exactly what's going on in the politics today.
Yeah.
Is that commerce is what actually drives America and in some ways destroys what is the best of America.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, I almost don't want to comment because I think you said that so well. But I agree with you, and I think that one of the things that we suffer from is the mythic narratives, right? Have hidden, right?
Yes.
The similarities of both of these narratives, right? That might be confusing to the rest of it, but in that there are two very similar stories there, right? And for me, those are the stories I most want to know, right? And I think that the way that people are turned from human beings into commodities, right? Really, we need to grapple with that, and we need to understand that, because that's not happening now, is it? Right? Right? Because these are what these old stories tell us, is that human beings do these things, and so we need to understand how it is that human beings turn each other into commodities, for example, because otherwise we'll keep doing it, right?
Well, and are.
And are doing it,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
One more question.
Thank you.
Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I learned so much. This idea, particularly revealing to me, was to see the relative density of settlement up around Salem and all of Massachusetts,
Yes.
when the writings that we get would seem to indicate that they're terrifying wilderness, dark woods,
That's
just at the end of town.
That's right.
That the savages are right at the edge of the woods, ready to jump on you.
That's right.
And so it's a psychological thing.
Yeah.
And there, as many people probably have heard, you know, that one of the explanations for the Salem witch hysteria
That's right.
was this idea that that it was shortly after King Philip's War.
That's right.
There was this terrible fear of the Indians. Again, this imagining of dark forces all out there in the woods, ready to get them at any moment.
Yeah.
And that was perhaps what led to this outbreak of hysteria.
Right. Right.
And so crazy because there were people out there. There were settlements.
That's right. That's right.
They were just people that were scary from the white perspective.
That's right. Yeah, and there's a great book that I think is what you're referring to by Mary Beth Norton called In the Devil's Snare. She's a historian at Cornell, and
one of the things that she talks about is the ways in which this warfare actually leads to the Salem witchcraft trials, and this imagination, right, of Satan right on the verge. Oh, sorry, I'll get up here. This imagination of Satan right on the verge of the settlements, and in many ways, you know, it's what we would think of as projection today, right? Because one of the things that the Puritans had to grapple with was thinking of themselves as men of God and men of Christ, and yet in their minds colonization required this horrid violence, right? To read the accounts, we had an earlier panel, James did an earlier talk on genocide, right? To read the actual accounts, not the narratives of the war, but the actual reports of the acts of violence that happened during this war are horrifying, right? And I have a pretty strong stomach, and I know about this stuff pretty well, but when I was reading through these reports, I had to stop. It was too much. And so they have to believe that these are people of Satan, right? Because otherwise it's unthinkable. It's unthinkable. And so one of the things that happens during the witchcraft trials is that the conflation of the enemy, this enemy from Satan who's living on the edges of the settlements, and the people within the settlements who are threatening it is there. It's also there during King Philip's War. They begin prosecuting Quakers, because Quakers are a threat, right? Not a violent threat at all, but they see as a threat to their spirituality. The other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is the geographical perceptions, right? So people are coming from England who are not used to forested environments. And as much as this is a managed forest environment, and if we were moving through it today, we would not think of it as scary and strange, most of us. To them it was, right? And so even the fact that these are developed towns, right? To them, they're also surrounded by woods, and this is a really frightening prospect, right? It's also the question of representation too, right? So it gets very convoluted, right? How much of this is representation? How much of this is perception, right? But I want to encourage you to also look at Mary Beth Norton's book, because she gives us a context for the Salem witchcraft trials that we otherwise wouldn't have. And in fact, most treatments of the Salem witchcraft trials don't even acknowledge that the English at that time are continuing to push upward into this Wabanaki space, the same space where all these people have gone to hide, you know, from the English. During the Salem witchcraft trials, the colonial project is full on. Right? And so some, again, of that violence which they are causing, which they are moving outwards, is then turning back internally on themselves. It's very complicated, interesting history. So thank you for bringing that up. Thanks, everybody, again.